Would you ask Ms. Smith to come back in, please? Thank you. Yes, please sit down and make yourself comfortable. All ready to carry on?
Yes, thank you, sir.
Good, thank you very much. Yes, Mr.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Smith, I now want to turn to aspects of non-compliance with national guidance as revealed by the gap analysis.
Yes.
And I'm going to start with the first subject matter there, which is warning about the danger of offering reassurance to callers. Can we start with the gap analysis, please, which you'll find at LFB 404750, page 11. And on that page, you will see, in the third column, entitled Gap Analysis, comparison of national guidance against LFB policy guidance and training, and the gap identified there between the national guidance and the LFB policy guidance and training was stated to be as follows. National Guidance 1093 acknowledges the possibility that an emotional bond may be formed between control operator and caller as the call progresses, however, emphasises is given to the fact that this relationship may be adverse and lead to the caller providing answers that they believe will be the desired response, and caution should be used when offering reassurance in case this leads to a false sense of security. LFB training package tends to encourage a strong attachment between caller and fire control operator and reiterates the use of reassuring phrases which may be construed as offering a false sense of security. And I want to focus particularly on that last sentence there. If we look across to the first column on this page, page 11, you see it says, attempt should be made to reassure the caller without promoting a false sense of security. That is what is set out in FSC 1093, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. Now, pausing there, do you agree that the training package in place before LACNOL did encourage the CRO to create a strong attachment with the caller?
Yes, I do.
And in the third column of the gap analysis in respect of that comparison, there's no mention there of any gap with policy 539 and national guidance that the 2007 version of PN 539 didn't include a warning akin to what we see here, is there?
No, it doesn't look like it, no.
And do you accept that that was a gap which should have been expressly identified in the gap analysis?
In terms of the current policy 539,
Yes.
not having that in. I'm sorry, I can't recall what the 2007 guidance had in it. Did it have about an emotional attachment in PN 539?
No, it didn't have an express warning in PN 539 that no emotional attachment should be formed and you mustn't offer a full sense of security. It didn't have that. So what I'm putting to you is that there was a gap between policy 539 and national guidance in that respect.
That we didn't make it explicit that they shouldn't have a contact. No, we didn't. No, I agree.
Why is that?
I think because it was to be put into the training and associated documents rather than in the policy. I think we had been, or the general feeling was that the policy, our emergency call management policy, was a bit too detailed and covered general information rather than policy, but I accept that could have gone in there as a point.
If you look at the recommendation in the last column, it says, place the LFB training guidance on call psychology more into context with 1093 national guidance to ensure, although fire control operator adopts aspects of reassurance such as exchanging names, other suggested phrases during training do not allow the quotes emotional link unquotes to be formed, and advice given is proactive and supportive without providing false reassurance. Those last few words there are important. Now we can see that that recommendation, can't we, focuses on amending the training guidance.
Yes.
Can you explain why, or whether you considered amending policy 539 specifically to include the fact that CROs should not form an emotional link with callers and be careful not to provide false reassurance?
No, I can't recall the conversations we would have had about that, but I believe from reading it that we would have thought that those elements would have been covered and reiterated in the training to all control staff.
If we look at policy 539 that was amended on the 3rd of September 2010, a date we've already seen, that is at LFB 404735. We looked at this just before the lunch break. If we go to page 16, we will find Appendix 3, Fire Survival Guidance. If you look at the bottom of the screen, bottom of the page, you've got assess, reassess, protect. And underneath protect, there's a paragraph that starts, if the caller cannot escape. And it says, if the caller cannot escape, offer reassurance, be positive, exclamation mark. Suggested phrases to use: listen to me, I'm going to help you. We'll get through this together. Stay calm, I'm going to help you. Do what I tell you to do. The firefighters will be with you very soon. The firefighters know where you are. And then over to page 17. Reassuring the caller will be beneficial as people will breathe more slowly when calm, making them less susceptible to the effects of smoke. Do you know why this version of PN 539, Policy 539, which was amended after the gap analysis had been completed earlier in 2010, referred to those detailed instructions about reassuring the caller without warning that doing so might provide false reassurance?
I don't, and that version there is not something I recognise from whenever I've had any involvement in updating Policy 539.
Right. I mean, looking at the last two, if you go back a page to the bottom of page 16, looking at those last two bullet points, those are promises or statements of fact, aren't they, which might very well create a false sense of security in the caller, mightn't they?
Yes, the firefighters will be with you very soon, I agree. Yes.
Can you explain, I think you can't explain, can you, how it came about that those, at least those two bullet points, remained in this policy, which was amended 6 months or so after the completion of the gap analysis, in order to bring it in line with Circular 93?
No, I can't, and I'm surprised that it is in there after our update on the gap analysis.
Who would be able to explain why those two bullet points remain in that policy, notwithstanding the precise gap identified in your gap analysis?
I don't know. Apologies, I don't know who updated that policy and why that was still left in there or remained in there.
Now, we know that there was a later version of this. Let's just look at this. This is at LFB 3028601. There's a later amendment to this policy. And if you go to at the bottom of the screen, it's slightly strange, this. I wonder if you can help me with it. The reviewed as current date, as we've just seen, if we scroll back to the top of page 1, remained 3rd of September 2010. If you scroll to the bottom of page 1, you can see that it says last amended date 3rd of February 2011. Just on that, why wasn't the date at the top of the page amended to February 2011, but remained instead 3rd of September 2010? Do you know?
No, I don't know. I think that just must have been an admin error.
What kind of error?
Or that someone had updated the policy on the 3rd of February 2011 but not updated it on the front page.
Right. Now, if we go to page 16, please, look at 4th line from the bottom. We do see in this policy, what we, I think, can fairly identify as the equivalent part of the September 2010 amended version, where you have 4 lines up from the bottom: reassure the caller and reassess the caller's situation. Example questions are: has that stopped the smoke coming in? Let me know if the smoke gets thicker. Turn the page, please, to page 17. Question at the top: what's happening now? Nothing there about telling the caller that the firemen know where you are. Now, it looks as if those 2 bullet points at least have been removed from this policy and replaced with the reassure and reassess the caller's situation. And that is the way it remained until the Grenfell Tower fire in 2017. Do you know, can you explain that change between September 2010 and February 2011?
I can't recall that. I can only assume that if someone had updated it, that maybe myself or Scott had looked at it, or someone else had identified that it hadn't actually been updated, and that we'd then updated it.
Right. Do you know whether that reassurance advice was removed in this February edition, if you like, of 539 because of the warning in FSC 1093 about not reassuring the caller?
Yes, and our investigations into the Lacanau House fire as well contributed to it.
No, well, that is a fair conclusion, but do you know as a fact that the reason the person who made this amendment made it was in response to the gap identified in the gap analysis?
Yes.
You do know that from your
I
own knowledge?
Do, because if you look at general, I would imagine this is at the same time that I had some involvement with policy 790.
Right.
And the general information looks like the information that was on the control information form at the bottom.
Can we go back then, in the light of that, to the Fire Service Circular 1093, and that is at LFB 403617. Page 1, paragraph 2, last sentence, and you'll remember this from phase 1, Ms. Smith. Additionally, in circumstances such as these, a fire control operator may need to take into account that the normal procedure of calming the caller may not be appropriate and may even be dangerous in some circumstances. Now, if we keep that on the screen and then go back, please, to the 3rd of February 2011 edition of Policy 539 that we were on a moment ago at LFB 000028601, page 16. We see no reference or even quotation of that warning in FSC 1093 on the page in front of you in the February 2011 version of PN 539 or the next page either. Can you explain why not?
Just that I would have imagined that we had removed it from all the training documents. We'd removed it from a previous version of the policy, and that there might have been clearer instruction in the training and the RIF.
Well, there might have been. Do you know whether there was?
Definitely in the training. I couldn't confirm in the RIF.
Right. Well, we'll come to look at that in a little more detail later on. But do you agree with me that there is nothing here in this re-amended policy now, post the gap analysis, that spells out to CROs that the normal procedure of calming the caller may not be appropriate and may even be dangerous in some circumstances. That's not spelt out in the policy, is it?
No, it's not spelled out.
And what I'm trying to work out is why that is so, given the prominence given to that concept in the 1993 Fire Service Circular and the LFB's desire to close the gap with it, which was what the gap analysis was for.
As I've already said, I think because we were comfortable and the Lacanau board was comfortable that it was in the training and had and items of reassurance had been removed from the policy, and the training and the procedures that control staff follow would have been more relevant to them than being in a policy.
Can you just help me with that answer? What would be the purpose of a policy? What's a policy for?
To provide guidance, to undertake a task or a role.
And why would the LFB be content that training should not reflect what was in the policy?
Well, I think they were. I think that the key principles of escape, assess, protect and rescue were in the policy. The finer detail was contained in the training that control staff could relate to.
Right. Put another way, why would the LFB be interested in updating or closing the gap between national guidance and training, but not wish to close the gap between national guidance and its own policy?
Like I say, I think there was always a desire, from my understanding of the gap analysis, it was to compare the national guidance to all elements. One of that was policy, but there was training as well and practices and procedures.
Now let's look at the Lacanau Control Report published in November 2012. That is at LFB 404724. It can also be found, because I've used this reference, at HOM 401124, but I'd like you to use the LFB reference, which we have on the screen. Can we go to page 50 in that, please? And on page 50, you can see that at paragraph 293, it says or finds as follows, and I should just tell you, putting it in context, that this is in section F6 of this report, which is conclusion about handling of the fire at Lacanau, 3rd of July 2009. Paragraph 293, expectations that callers would be rescued and stay put advice. COs had a clear expectation that fire crews would reach the callers quickly. Their experience was that fire appliances arrive quickly and that people are rescued by the brigade. This is borne out by the fact that only rarely, where FSG is given, do people die in fires, see section E3. As rescues by crews were not immediate, there is a question whether the CO and or callers could have assessed the risk of attempting to escape from the flat, and whether the risk of moving closer to the fire, but escaping, was less than staying put and awaiting rescue. COs relied on advising callers to stay put, expecting that this would keep callers safe from fire. Now, you confirmed, I think, in your evidence at phase 1 of this inquiry that you were familiar with this report at the time, and I think you told us the same again this morning.
Yes.
Did you assist in drafting this conclusion in this paragraph?
No, like I say, I think it had been reworded, but the conclusion was what we had identified, yes.
Yes. So in broad terms, did it
in
reflect
broad terms, yes.
It reflected your input, did it?
It did.
Yes. And presumably you gave that input before you departed for the CFOA?
I did, yes.
Yes. And when you gave input into that conclusion, was any thought given at that point as to how this lesson, the lesson to be drawn, as identified here, could be reflected in policy, such as Policy 539?
In terms of stay put advice, do you mean? And if that was explicit in Policy 539?
Well, not exclusively, no. I don't mean that at all. I'm showing you the paragraph. and asking whether, when you drafted that paragraph, the conclusion that it is inviting the reader to draw was one that you thought ought to be reflected in Policy 539.
So I think when we drew that conclusion, that was from a specific instance, and in the training we made sure that there was an assessment phase placed, and the CROs and the CROs would go through an assessment phase before they advised stay put. That was of a specific incident, a piece of advice where we hadn't asked the caller if they were being directly affected by fire, heat or smoke before we advised them to stay put. I think there was some deliberation with the board and with between the group of 4 of us that were working on this report that the stay put advice was to be re-emphasised, but that was the government guidance and we were just to follow that. So no, I don't think it would have made it into policy in case that would have changed.
Now, when you came back to the LFB from the CFOA in January 2015, did you yourself do anything to assess whether the lessons that you had identified in the Lacunar Control Report had been implemented into policy or training?
No. No.
You didn't?
No. So I left to perform another role, and a competent and capable individual would have done that. Scott was still there and would have been consistent, as was DAC Tim Cutbill, and there would have been a review on that. So no, I wouldn't have felt the need to do that.
At the time you came back, January 2015, not only had the gap analysis been completed some years before, but we'd seen the control report in November 2012. We'd had the inquest in January to March 2013, and then the coroner's Rule 43 Lacunar recommendations thereafter, and the establishment of the Lacunar Health Working Group and all of the work that followed that. When you arrived back in the LFB in January 2015, did you ask the question along the following lines? I've been away a long time. What has changed so far as policy and training are concerned, which reflects the lessons drawn from Lacunar House? It's a broad question. Did you ask it?
No, I didn't, but I think I shared my frustrations that the letter to DCLG hadn't been sent, and I think I provided some knowledge of the work that I had been doing on a national level to try and change the status of 1093 and progress that to a modern, useful document based on some of the findings in the Lacunar report. Right. So instead of asking what had changed in LFB, I tried to impart what I had done and tried to do, and my work with the National Operational Guidance Team to influence that on a larger scale.
So just to be clear, when you came back in January 15, you didn't seek, even for your own satisfaction, to do an exercise to see what had changed in the policy documents and what had changed in the training packages, which would reflect your own work on the gap analysis and your input into the November 2012 Lacunar Control Report?
No, I would have assumed that that would have been done by whoever replaced me at the time. But I also would have kept abreast of issues that were going on, and I certainly knew the outcomes from the coroner's inquest. I had a vested interest. It was about London control.
How could you have taken up the reins as essentially head of OST by this time, and certainly in charge of training, if you hadn't followed the thread through from your gap analysis through the changes and worked out whether or not they had been reflected in policy and training?
Because I had the principal operations manager and another senior operations manager alongside me, and we worked as a team. The senior operations manager that had been doing the role with training was on watch, and I could have spoken to them and they could have updated me on that. I didn't receive any of those briefings and just would have assumed that a competent, capable person would have fulfilled those requirements that were written in the Lakanal House report. It wouldn't have been for me to check that. That wasn't my role.
Let's turn to another topic then, under this the gap analysis heading, which is the need for continual reassessment. If we go to the control report annexures, back to the gap analysis, that is at LFB 404750, page 14. And here we see, in the last column, another recommendation. And this is in relation to the effects of smoke. And under the recommendation, it says C41 above, fire safety / fire behaviour presentation needs to include any possible effects of heat and smoke on callers. National Guidance 1093 highlights the possible effects of smoke on callers, but fails to offer the fire control operator any practical suggestions to deal with these possible changes. Any updates to 1093 National Guidance needs to provide a suggestion that fire control operators should continually reassess the situation, not only to remain aware of changing conditions within the premises, but also the state of mind of the caller. And just focusing there on the words should continually reassess the situation. Keep that in mind, and then if you then go to page 17 of the same document, there's a further recommendation we can see. In the right-hand column, National Guidance 1093 and LFB training material recognise the importance of initial assessment as the first stage of an FSG call. However, both documents do not convincingly explain the benefits of continual assessment or possible reassessment further into the call to ensure the situation or individual circumstances has not or is not changing. Can you explain what the purpose was of explaining the benefits of continual assessment or reassessment?
Can I explain the benefits of continual reassessment? Yes, because then you will be able to... both documents had an initial phase of assessment where you would gather the situation that the caller was in. But throughout the call, which could last a period of time, there was no place in the guidance or in our training to go back to the caller and ask how the situation had changed. And we thought that was particularly beneficial when you were talking to a caller, to know the circumstances that they were in. They might not tell you that the smoke had worsened, and therefore that might be affecting them and their individual circumstances. And that would be essential for a control officer to know to pass to the incident ground.
Yes, essential. Yes. We can look at it, but do you remember that the 2007 version of PN 539, the one current at the time of this gap analysis, does not say anything about the need on the part of the CRO continually to assess or reassess the situation? We can look at it if you like.
No, I'll take your word.
And given that, can you explain why this recommendation doesn't say anything about the need to amend Policy 539 so that it does bring home to the control room operator that essential point or that essential activity?
No, I can imagine, like it's the issues raised before, that it was in training and later then amended in 2011 to reflect, reassess. I'd be surprised if it wasn't in the updated version in 2011.
Well, before we get to that, because we can see that there was no recommendation, my question is, why was the recommendation focused on amending both the National Guidance and the LFB training material, but not LFB's Policy 539 as it then stood, the 2007 original version?
No, I'm sorry, I can't answer that. I don't know why.
Now, in fact, Policy 539, notwithstanding the absence of a recommendation, was amended to reflect the essential need for continual assessment and reassessment. Can we look at it? It's at LFB 404735. This is the 3rd of September 2010 amendment. If we go to page 16, where we were before, you could see just above the passage I put to you before, some words in bold, assess, reassess, protect. You see that?
Yes.
And under the reassess, it says reassess continually throughout the call, keep checking on the caller's situation. So, notwithstanding the absence of a recommendation in the gap analysis, is it right that that amendment did nonetheless encapsulate the principle of continual reassessment?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Then let's keep that on the screen, please, and move to the February 2011 version or further amendment at LFB 3028601, page 16. So, to be clear, on the left-hand side, you've got the 3rd of September 2010 amended Policy 539 that does reflect the gap or reflect the need for continual reassessment to be brought home to the control room operator. And then if you look at the right-hand side, we've got the 3rd of February 2011 further amendment. And if you compare the two reassessment sentences, in February 2011, it's become this, 4 lines up from the foot of the screen on the right, reassure the caller and reassess the caller's situation. Now, can you account for why there was a change there and the word continually throughout the call were omitted?
No, I just guess we'd moved to a point where we were putting in some example questions that control officers could use. And I think in reading it, it would mean the same thing, certainly on the training. There was a focus on reassessment. Continually, I suppose if you are picking up, I think that was implied, maybe not written specifically in policy, but definitely in the training. And there would have been continual reassessment and engagement with the caller while they provided advice.
Now, this is February 2011.
Yes.
Making all allowances for your role within OST at that time, did you notice that the words continually throughout the call, present in the 3rd of September 2010 version of PN 539, had been omitted from the 3rd of February 2011 version?
No, I didn't, and those that worked with me on the gap analysis and on the policy updates obviously didn't either. I think one would have assumed that it meant the same.
Right.
We were trying to get the same message across.
Who would have undertaken the exercise of making that change? Say would have, on the basis of your knowledge of the organisation at the time. Who was it, do you think, who did that?
I don't recall. I would imagine that it might have been members from the operational support team. It might have been training team.
Now, we know that the RAFs, the RIFs, were amended. Let's just see what they said. This is LFB 403542. And if we go to page 3, this is the FSG operator RIF as opposed to the supervisor RIF. If we go to page 3, you can see at the bottom, reassess regularly. So you've got the point about continual reassessment there. You see that?
Yes.
But going back to the point earlier that we were talking about, you've still got the reassurance being given along the lines of they're on their way, the firefighters are on their way, the firefighters know where you are, the firefighters are there, the firefighters are dealing with the fire. I think you would accept all of those contravene the clear warning in the last sentence of paragraph 2 of Fire Service Circular 1093.
I think we had many conversations about this, and actually whilst on the surface they may feel like they're exactly the same as before the Lackner House, actually the firefighters are on their way would be a true statement, as were the firefighters know where you are, because we would have passed that information to the incident ground and they would know where you are. The firefighters are there, again, would have been that they would have attended and they were in attendance at the incident. And it would be true to say that the firefighters are dealing with the fire. So I think between us, and I'm not sure if that was a debate that ever reached the board, but certainly between Control and Tim Cutbill and Tom Davis, that was certainly discussed, and those were felt that they were true statements, not misleading.
Well, they're not always true statements, are they, as we discovered on the night of the Grenfell Tower fire?
In terms of the firefighters are dealing with the fire, do you mean?
Well, the firefighters are on their way, they know where you are, they are there. Very often, as we know from the evidence on the night of the fire itself, the firefighters didn't know where people were.
I think, yes, I take your point, but I think from a Control perspective, the information that we'd passed, because we'd gathered that information and passed that on to the incident ground, we felt comfortable that that was
Coming back
not
to
misleading.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I cut across you.
Sorry, I said that we felt comfortable that that wasn't misleading.
Coming back to the reassessment regularly point, as we can see, it was inserted into the RIF when they were amended, but not into policy, as we can see, because although there was an amendment to insert continual reassessment into policy, it was then emended out, wasn't it? And you can't explain why. So the question then is, why was there a mismatch between the RIF, as we can see here, and Policy 539 as it eventuated in February 2011?
The only explanation I can give is that the policy wasn't as detailed as both the training notes and the RIF, which operators would have relied on.
Can we then turn to a different subtopic, which is lack of consolidation, before we move away from the gap analysis? Can we go back to the gap analysis, please, at page 8? That's LFB 404750, page 8. If you look at the third column, this is in relation to policy 539 Appendix 1, which is the fire survival guidance. No issues identified, however, the information is found in a number of LFB documents and needs to be consolidated. Before you were seconded to the CFOA, did you take any steps to remedy the need for consolidation?
Not that I can recall.
Why was that?
I don't know. I would imagine that I had worked on the gap analysis and that we had some actions to deliver from that. And any actions that I received from that, I would have implemented and actioned. I don't recall being tasked with identifying the amount of documentation and updating that.
Now, we'll come back to this gap analysis in due course in relation to later specific topics, Ms. Smith, but for now, let's move away from it. I want next to go to Action 13, as it was identified in the August 2018 Lacknell Assurance Review Report, and that's the letter to DCLG, the draft letter to DCLG. Can we go to your witness statement at paragraph 24, please, on page 10? And you say there, this, Scott Hayward and I also drafted an initial version of the Lacknell House report in Control and then handed this over to LFB. This report included recommendations arising from the gap analysis, including Control's recommendations to improve FSG. The recommendation was to write to DCLG recommending that they revise national guidance to 1. Provide further guidance on call handling techniques during an FSG call, 2. Emphasise the importance of reassessment during an FSG call, 3. Include fire safety input for different types of buildings with high-rise premises flagged as a particular example, and 4. Provide further guidance on effective communications between the control room and the incident ground, which should be a two-way flow of information. Now, we have two drafts of that document, one in November 2011 December 2011, and one in February 2012. Those dates, do they roughly configure with your recollection about when you drafted this with Scott Hayward?
Yes, they do.
Do you know what had prompted that letter? Or that drafting exercise, I should say?
The work from our gap analysis that had identified that we had some recommendations that we thought, after going through the Lacanau fire, would be extremely useful. The discussions that we'd had, that the guidance was written in 1993 and we were in 2007, so there was a possibility that lots had changed since then, and that would be worthwhile even just reviewing it on DCLG's behalf. And so I believe when we raised these with the board, we were asked to draft a letter to DCLG.
Who asked you to do that?
I think that came from the board, or maybe that was something that we'd been asked to prepare for the board on the results of our gap analysis.
Why did you feel that it was necessary for DCLG to revise the national guidance in the terms that you've outlined in your statement there, those four heads?
Again, through our experience that we've been through with Lacanau, as I've said, the guidance was drafted in 93. It was over 10 years later, and a lot had changed. Even technology had moved on in that time, and that was imperative. I've really always pushed for national guidance for control staff. I was conscious that even though we, as a control room, had been through Lacanau, which had been a unique incident at that time, no other fire control room had been through that and experienced that actually our findings probably didn't capture everything that had gone on in different fire control rooms and in the different sector, and that there was a responsibility that someone from with that experience needed to invest in reviewing and investigating what new methods were out there that could help control staff.
And what, just looking at call handling techniques, the first of those, what further particular guidance did you want the government to provide?
From recollection on the gap analysis, I think that was example questions. So we'd looked at proactive and reactive techniques from 1093, and we'd put those into our training in LFB, but there were no national examples of how to ask proactive questions or what proactive questions to ask.
Right. Was your assumption that just as the LFB had made mistakes, to be blunt, about the way in which the control room had responded to the Lacanau House fire, you were assuming that other fire and rescue services might very well do the same and therefore would benefit from what you had learned?
Yes, indeed.
Yes. Looking at fire safety input, what particular fire safety input did you want the government to flag?
Or specifically high-rise premises. So we had we'd reviewed 1093. I think you've just shown the excerpt where it says about high-rise, but I believe that was the only reference to high-rise residential buildings, and obviously it doesn't mention stay put or the guidance, and we thought that would be essential.
Now, given that initiative, before you left for the CFOA, did you take any steps to ensure that your own LFB guidance, your own policies, adequately addressed those four areas of concern you set out there?
I think, yes, the gap analysis as well indicated those, and I think through either commenting on training packages or discussing it as a group of three, I would have believed that was happening.
Now, can we then look at LFB 30844039, to see what the Lackland House Board was doing when they received the draft. These are the minutes for the 12th of December 2011 of the Lackland Board, and you can see that you were one of those present, fourth from the bottom of the list, just below Scott Hayward. Yes. SOM control. If you go to page 2, it says under section 8.1, under the heading Control, the draft letter to CLG has been reviewed by Control and Legal and is now ready to be sent to CLG. The Commissioner confirmed that the letter should be sent. Action JS-SH to provide the final letter to the Commissioner to be signed. See that? Now,
Yes.
Do you agree that at that stage it was ready to be sent?
Yes, I do.
Did you or Scott Hayward provide the final letter to the Commissioner for it to be signed?
I believe it was in draft. Yes, I believe Scott did. I'm not sure directly to the Commissioner, but...
Now, you say at paragraph 25 of your statement, and we don't need to go back to it, Ms Smith, but you say, I understand that the Commissioner did not sign and send this letter. And there are Lackland House Board meeting minutes for a period after you'd left to go to the CFOA which confirmed that and the decision that the letter should not be sent. Do you know why it wasn't sent? No. You don't. When you returned in January 2015, did you investigate what had happened to your draft letter?
No, I knew it hadn't been sent.
Did you ask the question, why hadn't it been sent?
Frequently with Scott.
And what did he tell you?
I can't recall, but it wasn't sent. And I had been disappointed and voiced my disappointment because I felt that I had been working from another angle in my role of CFOA to try and change and get some national guidance and some up-to-date national guidance, especially for fire survival.
You asked the question frequently with Scott, and you were disappointed and voiced your disappointment for the reasons you've just given. Are you sure you can't remember even a trace of what Scott Hayward told you by way of explanation when you investigated?
Probably that they didn't want it sent, LFB.
Is there what could the reason have been? I'm not asking you to speculate. I'm asking you to search back into your memory to see if you can retrieve a reason.
I don't know. I don't know why it wasn't sent. I thought it was a valid letter and it had some valid points on it and that it should have been raised.
Do you know whether the letter was ever reviewed after the inquest was concluded in March 2013?
I don't know.
If you go to page 11 of your statement, please. At the very top of the page, within paragraph 25, you say, however, in the period following my departure for CFOA, I understand that OST ensured that steps were taken internally to address these concerns, such as training with the command units and training on how to communicate FSG information to the incident ground. Now let's go first, please, to LFB 404744. This is the draft of the letter to DCLG that you had prepared with Scott Hayward in December 2011. The first of the two. We saw a later one dated the 3rd of February 2011 with him. 2012 with him. I just want to ask you about one or two of the recommendations in here. If you cast your eye down to paragraph 2, if we could have that blown up a bit, please. It says, provide guidance to maintain the caller's safety, a review of fire safety advice to reflect more current fire safety developments, which would further support fire control operators to engage with callers when assessing the situation and exploring any possible means of protection and escape. What were the current fire safety developments that you wanted revised national fire safety advice there to reflect?
I don't think we knew what they were. I think that's why we wanted a review, because I don't think we assumed that we were experts in that, and certainly not at fire safety, and that we wanted some detailed research into what advice could then now be available that we could add into our guidance and share with other control rooms. So it wasn't something that we'd identified because we knew what advice to give, but actually that we wanted support and someone to look into that and tell us what we could.
So you weren't working on the basis, is this right, that there were current fire safety developments that you knew about and wanted fire safety advice to reflect. Is that right?
No, we made an assumption that the guidance was over 10 years old,
Yes.
and that buildings had moved on and that fire safety had moved on, and there may well be different advice that we could offer a caller.
I follow. Looking at the 4 principles stroke assessment, updated national guidance could recommend that fire control operators should continually reassess the situation throughout the call to remain aware of any changing conditions within the premises and the physical and or mental state of the caller. Why was it important for national guidance to be updated to reflect that?
Well, I think that was one of our findings from Lacanau, and we thought that would be beneficial, as we've just explored, about why we should continually reassess when we're talking to a caller.
Yes. And given the importance of national guidance to that point, does that explain, how does that explain the fact that the policies were not updated to reflect continual reassessment as we've seen? Let me put the question a slightly different way. Given that the 4 principles and the need for continual reassessment were important, and this is December 2011, can you explain, going back to the point we were on before, why Policy 539 at that stage, which is after February 2011, did not reinforce or say anything about continual reassessment?
No, not in any more detail than I've already explained.
If you turn the page to item 7, supervisory roles, it says, supervisory roles, in addition to recognising the role other fire control operators can play in an FSG call, national guidance could go further to recognise and develop training for the supervisory role within the control room to better reflect current practices. The supervisory role should be able to offer support to control operators handling FSG calls and act as a conduit for information between the call taker and the incident ground. Did you take steps to make sure that the training was developed and put in place for supervisors to train them on how to offer to support CROs who are handling FSG calls?
No, that wasn't my role at the time, but I was involved in the gap analysis, and we did notice that the supervisors may benefit from some additional training with some support mechanisms to support the control officer. And that's why it was recommended, because it wasn't in 1093 and wasn't recognised as a role, and it was quite an important role, we felt.
So you say some of the training was updated? Was that the...
I believe some of the training was updated, yes.
We'll come back to that in due course. Putting the gap analysis to one side, I'd next like to ask you about other aspects of Policy 539 that were updated in September 2010. We've seen that version. Can we go to LFB 50737? This is in fact the version reviewed as at current in March 2014. But it follows on from the amendments that were done in September 2010. If you go to page 16, we start with the definition of an FSG call, and on page 16 in the first paragraph it says this: the London Fire Brigade define a fire survival guidance call as being a call to brigade control where the caller believes that they are unable to leave their premises due to the effects of fire, and where the control room officer remains on the line, providing appropriate advice until either the caller is able to leave by their own means, is rescued by the fire brigade, or the line is cleared. Now, that definition, it was different, wasn't it, from the definition of a fire survival guidance call in the 2007 original?
I believe part of the work with the Lacanau House investigation and the board, we were asked to define rewrite the definition of a fire survival guidance call.
Well, so that we can all see and compare and contrast the two, let's keep that on the screen, left-hand side, and have on the right-hand side the original 2007 edition, please. That is at LFB 3028382, page 20. LFB 30288382. So, on the left-hand side, 3rd of September 2010, amendment, right-hand side, 2007 original. And if you look at the definition of fire survival guidance in the 2007 original, it says this: there may be occasions where, during the course of handling an emergency call, it is apparent that the caller is trapped inside the premises and cannot escape. Prompts are in place on the computer-aided mobilising system to assist control officers in, and then you get 3 bullet points: providing guidance to maintain the caller's safety, provide reassurance to the caller that help and assistance is forthcoming, strengthen relationship with caller. You see that?
Yes.
Now, you then look across to the left and see the new definition in 2010, which I read to you in the first paragraph. My question comparing the two is this: do you know where the definition that was used in the 2010 edition of PN 539 to replace the definition of fire survival guidance in the original 2007 version came from?
Yes, I believe it came from us as a control room working together with the DAC, Tim Cutbill and Tom Davis, and was agreed by the board, the Lacanal board.
So it didn't come from any national guidance?
No, I don't believe so. I think one of the recommendations, that we recommend to CFOA was to define a fire survival guidance call. Possibly, that may have come out of it.
Do you know why the definition of fire survival guidance was changed from the 2007 original version?
So I think the definition is just, that looks like a complete lift from 1093, and from my recollection, London Fire Brigade wanted a more robust definition.
A more robust definition?
Yes.
Given that the definition had changed from the earlier version of the policy, as we can see, did you seek to test whether the definition that was adopted might work in practice?
Yes, I think that's why we agreed with the definition, because we thought it would work in practice.
Yes, but did you seek to test it? Did you road test it?
On the incidents that we'd previously dealt with in terms of fire survival guidance calls, yes, that was a true reflection of what they were.
Did you appreciate at the time that the fire survival guidance call is defined by, among other things, the fact that the control room officer remains on the line, providing appropriate advice until the line is cleared?
Yes.
So you don't know it's a fire survival guidance call until the end?
No, I don't believe it reads like that. My understanding is that it is a fire survival guidance call where you provide advice, and where either the control room officer remains on the line or the caller is able to leave on their own means or is rescued.
Yes. I mean, forgive the slightly semantic approach to this, but why was it thought appropriate by the group of people who created this definition to define a fire survival guidance call by the activity of the control room officer, as opposed simply to by the situation in which the caller found themselves?
I think because it was... sorry, could you talk me through that again?
Yes.
Sorry.
Why was it thought appropriate to define whether a call was a fire survival guidance call by reference to what the control room officer did, as opposed to what the caller was telling them?
I don't think that was the aim of it. It was just to bring a clarity that actually those are calls where the fire survival guidance calls are where we remain on the line to provide advice, and it just documented it there.
Did you appreciate at the time, when formulating that definition, that if an FSG call required the continued presence of a CRO on the line until clearance, then the number of simultaneous FSG calls that could ever be received and handled at one time could only match the number of CROs and supervisors available to handle them.
Yes.
And did you consider what the practical effect of that would be?
Yes, I think we did. We thought that was entirely possible, that was the process, and that there was benefit for a control room remaining on the line whilst providing, as it says there, the appropriate advice and guidance. In terms of availability and stuff, we'd never experienced where our control room had reached capacity that we weren't able to provide that. And if we had a network and some arrangements with other fire and rescue service control rooms that would have been able to deal with that.
Now, continuing on that theme, can we look at paragraph 43 of your statement, page 17?
Before we go to that, can I just ask this? Was any training given to the control room officers to stay on the line, as it were, indefinitely? Was that what they were told to do?
I think just from the history of it and my understanding of it and how it was managed and how I've managed it myself, that you would stay on the line until the caller was rescued or managed to escape.
You might not. I mean, if you said to the caller, gave the advice about blocking up the entry of smoke and so on,
Yeah.
and the caller said, yes, all right, and I've done that, you might say, particularly if you've got other calls coming in, you might think it was better to say, well, see how you get on and ring me back if you still have a problem.
So
And then you could deal with another call.
you could, but that, in my experience and our review, when we were looking at FSG calls, specifically in London, that wasn't done. We stayed with the caller and provided some further reassurance whilst they were awaiting rescue.
Right. Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, Mr. Bennett.
Yes. Can we look at paragraph 43 of your statement, please? And you say there, in response to the question, how the control room should handle multiple FSG calls that are received concurrently. As noted above in my response to question 6C, prior to the fire at Grenfell Tower, it was considered that control would receive multiple concurrent FSG calls, 2 or 3 FSG calls, in relation to one incident. However, it was not envisaged that any additional measures were necessary to support those 2 or 3 concurrent calls, in addition to the current support arrangements with BT and buddy control rooms documented in PN 539, Emergency Call Management. Multiple FSG calls in the volume received on the night of the Grenfell Tower fire was not contemplated as a foreseeable event. Now, 2 or 3 FSG calls, you say, given that the Lacknell House incident had 5 FSG calls, including 2 from one flat, why did you consider that there would be fewer concurrent FSG calls at other incidents?
I don't think we did. I think we just said that we'd only received one incident where we'd received and we'd been talking to 2 or 3 callers providing fire survival guidance at a time for a duration in one incident, and that was our first experience of it, and that we hadn't envisaged that we needed any additional measures. The control room on the Lacknell House fire, whilst busy, never exceeded capacity. In fact, we had 2 senior control officers over at our Stratford fallback that weren't involved in the incident, but could have been had they needed to answer calls or deal with other tasks. So outside of the arrangements that were already in place with BT and our buddy control rooms, no, we didn't foresee any other arrangements needed to be put in place.
Now, you're dealing here with concurrent calls, and you identify 2 or 3 as those which control would or might receive from one incident. Now, at Lacknell, there were 5 FSG calls,
Yes.
2 of which were from the same flat and therefore, by definition, not concurrent. How many calls do you remember of the 4 were concurrent at Lacknell?
Of the 5?
Well, there were 5 FSG calls in all. 2 were from the same flat, I think flat 68.
Yeah.
That leaves, I suppose, 3. It could be concurrent. Of those 3, were they all concurrent or were fewer concurrent?
No, I believe at one point we had 3 operators taking 3 FSG calls.
Right.
But there is a timeline in the Lacknell report.
Yes, there is. I thought it was quicker and easier to ask you.
Sorry.
You were there. So does that explain where the number 2 or 3 FSG calls, concurrent FSG calls, comes from? The fact that at Lacknell there were only 3 concurrent FSG calls, 5 in all.
Yes, I think that using the history, and when we were looking at the Lacknell file, we looked back at previous incidents, and certainly since, I don't believe that there had been any more.
Nonetheless, did you give any thought to the risk that although there were 3 concurrent FSG calls, there were still 4 callers needing FSG advice, and therefore there was a risk, I would suggest a real risk, that the number 3 could be exceeded and it could become 4?
Potentially, but again, even if it had been 4, we hadn't exceeded our capacity, and we had arrangements in place if we did, and because an FSG call would be classed as a life or a risk critical call, that if we were dealing with other calls, say to a car on fire or smoking in the area, that actually BT had a mechanism to alert us to those life risk calls, and they would pass them through to us as a priority, so they would be answered and dealt with.
Now, can we go to page 12 of your statement, paragraph 29? You say at the foot of that page, in answer to the question, please explain what consideration, if any, was given to the challenges posed by incidents involving multiple FSG calls as part of the revision of the RIFs. You say, we did not consider multiple FSG calls as part of the revision of the RIFs. In the control room, we can receive multiple calls relating to one incident, but we train CROs to recognise when an incident is in progress to add their recordings to an incident. During the Lacknell House incident, we received around 5 to 8 FSG calls, but this was not the same scale as the FSG calls that arose during the Grenfell Tower fire. At the time of the Grenfell fire, quotes, multiple FSG, close quotes, calls was not a known phrase or concept within the LFB or nationally. Now, I just want to look at that a little bit more closely. When you say it wasn't a known phrase or concept nationally, what are you basing your evidence on there?
And I apologise, I think that might have come very unclear. But I think when I was asked that question, just in terms of multiple FSG calls, I'm just taken back to the Grenfell Tower incident. But obviously I realised that the concept of multiple FSG calls, and I knew, and we had planned for that there may be 1 or 2 FSG calls throughout an incident, which would make it multiple FSG calls. I just meant in the size and scale experienced at Grenfell, so apologies.
So you weren't saying that there was never any discussion about or consideration of the possibility?
No, I realised how that reads, but I wasn't. Apologies.
Now, can we go to LFB 3090024, please? If we look at this run of emails and look at the second email on the page, you can see that this is an email from Helen Dowes at West Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Services on the 14th of July 2010 to you. Subject HSE request. Hi Joe. At our YHRORG meeting today, and I won't ask you what that stands for unless you can tell me, A request from the HSE was discussed regarding fire survival guidance for large amounts of persons trapped in property fires. This, I believe, was as an outcome of the Lakanal House incident. Do you currently have anything in place? I know from Humberside's point of view, guidance provided was mainly aimed at individual dwellings rather than HMOs and high-rise buildings. I'm going to ask the question in region, but I was just interested in your protocols. Regards, Helen. And you reply on the 16th of July 2010, 2 days later. Hi, Helen. Sorry for the delayed response. It has been down to being locked away in a room for several days this week, attempting to complete our report for the Lakanal incident. Can I ask what the YHRORG is and the general discussions that were held around FSG for large amounts of people? I can say that we have not identified giving FSG to multiple persons. Our training in FSG does reflect 1093, so you're right, in that it does not really cover high-rise or HMO. We're currently drafting a letter to CLG with some points which we'll feel could be updated in 1093. However, where this goes with fire control project, I'm not sure. I'll keep asking the question, who is ensuring that we stuck to these extant documents, such as fire service circulars, but CCOPs say they are, ? Can we talk more at our next SOM meeting? If you need some further info before then let me know and I'll give you a ring. Now, there's quite a bit in that, which I think we probably don't need to pursue, but were you aware that there had been general discussions around FSG, or about FSG, for large numbers of people, at least in the West Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service at the time?
No, I think the YHR stands for the Yorks and Humberside region, and Helen Dowse was a senior operations manager in charge of that region, and was working towards a fire control room for Yorks and Humberside.
Yes, but my question is, were you aware that there had been general discussions about FSG for large numbers of callers, at least in her area?
Yes, from the email she sent me.
What did you understand her to mean when she said large amounts of persons trapped in property fires?
Well, what I don't think I really understood, because as I responded, I say we've not identified giving FSG to multiple persons. I'm sure we probably followed that up at our next meeting, or she may have rung me, because yes, I would have been interested about why, and I may have thought that actually they may have misinterpreted what happened at the incident, but it was probably something I would have taken on board to share with the senior operation managers group about how the Lakanal incident had happened and occurred, and what we were doing about it.
When you saw her expression, large amounts of persons trapped in property fires, did a number come into your head?
Yes, probably I would say large to me would seem over 10, and I would have replied that hadn't been identified at Lakanal.
Did you understand at the very least that the kinds of buildings which would present a risk of multiple FSG calls, large amounts of persons trapped in property fires, possibly 10, would be high-rises and HMOs?
Yes, I think we both identify that.
Now, you refer to drafting a letter to CLG. Was that the letter we discussed earlier?
Yes.
And you asked her if you could talk more at the next SOM meeting. Were there regular meetings between SOMs, between different fire and rescue service control rooms?
Yes, we would all meet as a collective around the country whilst we were working to establish fire control. But I noticed that's in 2010, so whether we had any meetings after that, because I believe the project was disbanded at the end of 2010.
Yes. And during those SOM meetings, did the subject ever come up about how control rooms would handle concurrent FSG calls, particularly from high-rise buildings?
Not that I can recall specifically. I'm sure we would have maybe discussed it as a peer-to-peer group. We were talking about a range of issues and how to implement the changes that DCLG were wanting to make to policies and procedures and how they would work in a fire control network.
After this email exchange, did you consider further whether you should prepare for giving fire survival guidance to large numbers of persons?
No, I think I probably responded is what I'm trying to respond to her, is to say that wasn't in our experience. We hadn't done that, so
Right.
No, that wasn't a consideration.
So did you take this topic any further, either with her or internally within the LFB?
Not internally with the LFB, and I'm sure we would have discussed it at our next meeting, but it's 2010. I'm sorry, I can't recall.
Yes. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment? We're about to...
Yes, I think it is. Thank you very much.
Subtopics.
I think it's time we had a break for the afternoon. We'll stop now and we'll resume, please, at 3:30. And again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room.
Okay.
All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. 3:30 then, please. Thank you. Thank you. Would you ask Ms. Smith to come back in, please? Thank you. All right. Very good. You ready to carry on?
Yes, thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Smith, I'd like to ask you now about the exercise called the Haygate Challenge, which took place on the 16th of June 2011. Do you remember it?
Vaguely, yes.
Vaguely. It was an 8-pump exercise on the 16th of June to test both the then current high-rise policy and the new draft FSG policy, policy 790. Do you remember that at that time it was still in draft? It was called draft 155, wasn't
Yes, I do.
Now, can we go then to the plans for that exercise at LFB 3033345? This is an email at the foot of your screen from Andy Rowe of the 8th of May 2011 to a large number of recipients, including you, as you'll see, and Scott Hayward. Yes?
Yes.
Most of the recipients were operations, but you and Scott Hayward from the control room. Yes?
Yes.
Hello all. Thank you for volunteering to act either as a participant or safety stroke observer for this exercise. And if you go to page 2, please, you'll see that there is a list of participants, and halfway down the list you'll see that control observer stroke facilitators, POM Scott Hayward, SOM Joanne Stibbard. Do you see that?
Yes.
Misspells your name, but there it is. And then if you go to page 3, he sets out the exercise structure and timings. And he says this. The exercise is a wet drill situated in a derelict high-rise block in Southwark. Control are running a background exercise for their staff, so this will be run as a live incident on ProCAD with dedicated airwave channel, a live control room, including an officer of the watch and control operators dedicated to the exercise. MDT will be live, as will CSS. Crews will be riding minimum on both the CU and the appliances. To add to the realism, crews will be mobilised by printer from their own stations. We will brief all crews at E35, E35 and H24, dependent on their base location in the morning before they return to their own stations for an early lunch, ready to be mobilised, and there are some exceptions. Senior officers will be mobilised by pager, as per a real incident, but will given a dedicated exercise number to ring paging to change status, etc. We will brief all senior officer participants at STC/Union Street to be paged for the incident. And then there's a later briefing. Facilitators and safety stroke observers will also be briefed later in the morning and will then make our way straight afterwards to the exercise venue. Now, can you explain what he meant, or what you understood he meant when he said control are running a background exercise for their staff?
So, from recollection, I believe we ran a mini exercise in control in line with this exercise, where we inputted a number of calls and some FSG calls for staff, and then the information was passed to the incident ground as trying to simulate a live incident.
Do you remember attending the exercise as a control observer or facilitator with Scott Hayward?
No, so I think I attended the control room. I think I was in the control room. Scott may have gone to the incident to witness the exercise, but I believe I was in the control room when this was.
Do you remember what you did specifically in the control room as part of that exercise?
I think it was the role of facilitator and ensuring the exercise timings ran to time and the injects were input successfully.
And were there any FSG calls involved?
I believe so, yes.
How many?
I couldn't say. I would imagine 2 or 3.
Was any discussion held with Andy Rowe about how many FSG calls should be held as part of that exercise?
There might well have been, but I can't recall. Apologies.
Do you remember being involved in such discussions, even though you might not remember the detail?
I don't know. and I don't know why. I'm not even sure how many FSG calls we input into the control exercise. I can remember seeing the exercise brief and some of the scenario session, some of the scenarios that we were using, but I can't recall who determined the number of FSG calls.
Was there any? I suppose it would follow from what you've just told us that there was no discussion about testing concurrent FSG calls.
I can't recall the timings. There may have been some timings where 2 were received at once, but I can't recall that. I'm sorry.
Was this not the opportunity to, given the scale of this challenge, this exercise, to test what had happened at Lacanau and have 3 concurrent FSG calls running, which was the number, or potentially the number, at Lacanau?
It may have been, and we may well have done that.
You don't recall?
I don't recall in terms of exercise timings, no, sorry.
Can we look at LFB 000-33393? And this is an email run after the challenge had taken place. If we go to page 2, we can see an email from Andy Rell on the 30th of June 2011. There it is, to a large number of recipients, including not in fact you're including you, as it turns out.
No.
But that I don't think matters. He attaches a document that he says records all the feedback received in relation to the draft high-rise FSG policies and the Incident Information Board. I've tried to record it as accurately as possible based on the minutes of the debrief and individual written comments submitted prior and post-exercise. Apologies if I've missed anything, but there has been a massive feedback given. Please let me know if you think I've omitted anything vital. So there's what he says. If you look at the feedback report he sends, it's at LFB 3033384. This is the report. Do you remember being part of any feedback meeting or discussion after the exercise?
No, I don't.
Do you remember whether Scott Hayward attended the feedback meeting?
No, I don't, sorry.
You don't remember that either. Looking at this report, if we go to page 1, it's entitled Feedback, High-Rise and FSG Policies, Test Exercise, 16th June 2011, Southwark. Do you remember looking at this or seeing this document at the time, end of June 2011? You don't? Do you remember looking at it at any stage?
No.
Is this the first time you've ever seen it?
I believe so, yes.
Can you explain why that might be so, given your role in 2011?
Well, I can only assume that we weren't asked for the feedback because we weren't CC'd into the initial feedback request.
It's odd that, isn't it? Because this is one of the things that's being tested is the FSG policies. Is there any good reason why control would not have been at the front and centre of feedback?
No, I think in general terms that control are often seen as a separate identity in the organisation, and this probably focused on the operational response, and therefore it may not have occurred to them to include us and the feedback we had.
Can we go to page 10 in this document, please? And you'll see there's a heading, Fire Survival Guidance Policy. You see in the middle of the screen there's a shaded box with the words Fire Survival Guidance Policy in it.
I do.
And in the right-hand column, opposite key point summary, introduction, and then FSG call definition, you've got the feedback on the right. No commentary, no commentary, no commentary. In each case, separate feedback from control to be submitted. You see that?
Yes.
Do you know whether any separate feedback was given back, was submitted in relation either to the introduction or the FS call definition?
I don't know.
And then at the bottom of page 10, it says, information gathered by control, and there are 2 bullet points, radio operators on the appliances, and then the last one, which I want just to focus on with you. The consensus was that the carbonated form worked adequately for 4 flats as per the exercise, but would have been unmanageable for 20 plus calls, as one CU had experienced at an incident the week before. Now, this suggests that the exercise involved 4 FSG calls. Do you think that's right?
Yes, possibly.
Right. Does that tell us that more than 2 or 3, which is the number you identified, was a real possibility? The receipt of more than 3 FSG calls was a real possibility?
No, I think that acknowledges that there is a potential to receive more calls to an incident of that type, but I don't think that indicates that more FSG calls. There are potential for more FSG calls.
You don't?
No, so I think that there is a there's some record that they recognise that we, as a matter of course, could receive numerous calls to a high-rise fire, but 1 or 2 or potentially 3 would require fire survival guidance, but other calls wouldn't require that.
Do you know who decided that 4 FSG calls should be tested in this exercise?
I don't know.
Did you or Scott Hayward have any input into that number?
I really don't recall. I don't believe so.
Can you explain why, even though 5 FSG calls in total were received at Lacknell House, only 4 were the subject of this exercise?
No, it would be useful to see the incident timeline, to see how they requested that the calls come in. It might have been something that the incident exercise, the exercise facilitators had agreed to.
You'll notice from the text I read out to you that one CU had experienced at an incident the week before 20 plus calls. Now, do you know what that's about? Do you remember your control room receiving 20 calls?
Not specifically what the incident that's relating to, but acknowledgement that the control room had received 20 calls to an incident wouldn't have surprised me.
Well, it's the CU experiencing 20 calls.
Yeah. So
the CU would only experience 20 calls if there were 20 which had generated information for the CU to receive from the control room and pass into the bridgehead. Is that right?
So 20 calls with pertinent information. I can't recall that incident, and I'm unsure that the incident would have generated 20 separate pieces of information that needed to be passed to a CU. But yes, it could have, especially this was in 2010, so we'd made some changes to the way we communicated with the command unit, and we were confident as a control room that we were gathering all the information and passing it to the incident ground, so that could have been possible.
I mean, this was 2011, in fact.
Oh, yeah.
But, to be clear here, the comparison that's being made in this feedback form, the point here is that the carbonated form, whatever that was, perhaps it was the CIF, worked adequately for 4 flats as per the exercise, so 4 FSG calls from 4 separate flats, but would have been unmanageable for 20 plus calls. Now, I'm not asking you to interpret the text of the feedback form, but what's indicated here is that at 4 it's fine, but at 20 it's not. And there had been 20 at a previous incident the week before, so sometime in early June 2011. My first question on that is, do you recall the control room receiving 20 fire survival guidance calls or 20 calls from separate flats, even if not strictly fire survival guidance, in early June 2011?
Well, that's quite a big distinction. 20 calls from generated by a fire in a block of flats, I wouldn't have thought would have been unimaginable, and I would have thought we would have experienced that. 20 FSG calls, no. And historically, and evidence goes to show that we'd never received that many prior to the night of Grenfell. And 20 separate pieces of information from individual flats, possibly, but I would say that that was highly unlikely, and I would have thought from the incident and from the feedback on this form that might have generated some additional work for both the operational response, and maybe that would have fed back into the control room.
And if you go a little bit further down on page 11, under recording of information, the consensus and specific feedback from the CUs was that even with only 4 FSG calls, the CU staff riding, as only 2 could not deal with the workload associated with the FSG policy and their normal duties. It looks, digging deeper into this document, that there were 4 FSG calls at this exercise, which, even with those numbers, made difficulties for the CU staff. That's what seems to have been fed back.
Yes, I agree.
And therefore, 20 would have made life impossible, wouldn't it? That seems to be the feedback, if you link the 2 passages together.
That appears to be the feedback, but I'm not. I don't know the process that the CUs undertake to record that information.
And if we go to page 12, the top box, second bullet point, an individual suggestion was made that it would be an idea to mobilise a specific FSG response, as with the FF emergency policy, at a multiple FSG call incident. This would provide an additional 2 SMs, station managers, for FSG, a CU, command unit, and crews to carry out the recording and specific search and rescue tasks associated. CSS was used throughout and found to be very useful in regard to FSG. So the concept of multiple FSG calls, coming back to it, was clearly being examined in this exercise in June 2011, yes?
Yes.
Yes, and the multiple there was 4, yes?
Yes.
And that was found on the feedback to create difficulties, at least for the CU officers. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. And then in the box below that, you'll see 8, advice to fire survival guidance callers. No commentary from crews, separate feedback to control to be submitted. Again, do you know whether any separate feedback was ever submitted from control on that issue?
I don't know.
There was then a debrief meeting, and we can look at the minutes for that, please, at LFB 3056628. If we look at page 1, you can see the start of it. It was on the 16th of June 2011, immediately after the exercise, it appears. Do you remember attending that, or do you remember whether yourself, Scott Hayward, attended that?
I believe we both did.
You think you both did?
Yes.
And then if you go to page 4, looking at paragraph 2, subject 2, draft fire survival guidance calls policy draft 155, paragraph 2, information gathering. And then if you look at the third bullet point down, it says, unknown, the whole FSG recording was hard enough to manage with 4 flats. It would be almost impossible should you have 60 flats involved. Can this information not be sent to the MDT? Now, do you remember that discussion?
I don't know.
It looks from this note of it that the concept of large numbers of FSG calls, in this case possibly 60 flats, was being discussed in the debrief, wasn't it?
It looks like the the concern was that managing that amount of information was difficult for a CU crew, and presumably that's why they're asking for control to send the information to an MDT instead.
Who came up with the number 60, do you know?
I don't.
I mean, given that the number appears in this document, can we take it that the number of 60 flats involved in FSG recordings was not unimaginable?
I don't recall the conversation, so whilst it's documented there, I don't know who made that comment and the reason for and their thinking behind that. Sorry.
Between the date of the Lacknell House fire in July 2009 and the Grenfell Tower fire in June 2017, were you aware of incidents that had involved more than 2 or 3 fire survival guidance calls?
Yes, I believe 1 or 2.
Can you tell us which they are?
I think there was a fire at Adair Tower in late 2015, was that? Beginning of 2016?
31st of October 2015.
In 2015.
Yeah.
And one at the Marriott Hotel in Docklands, although, sorry, you said more than 4, didn't you?
More than 2 or 3?
Yes, so the fire at the Marriott Hotel.
So the reason I've selected 2 or 3 is because you've selected that as your base number for multiple. Marriott Hotel fire is the second of the 2 examples. I'd like to look at those with you. So let's start with the Marriott Hotel fire. It was on the 11th of November 2010, so 11 years ago to the day today, and it was a 10-pump fire in Poplar.
It was, yes.
And I think you were in attendance on the night of the fire.
I did. I was the control duty manager and I did attend, yeah.
Yes. Do you recall that there were 17 FSG calls received at that fire?
No, I don't believe there were.
You don't believe there were?
No. I believe there were 17. There may have been 17 calls, but not 17 fire survival guidance calls.
And the reason I put 17 to you is there's a document which suggests it. That's LFB 00109485. And this is a draft of draft 155. And if we go in that, which is I think then circulating, and if we go to that, page 3, you'll see in page 3 there's a comment inserted on the 14th of February 2011 by someone called Nickel, and it's at the foot of the page. We'll need to blow it up. It's in the blue bubble, the last blue bubble, and the reason I say 14th of February 2011 by Nickel is at the end in the amendments part for those who want to see it. But if you look and see what he says in the bubble, he says this. At a recent 10 PF in Docklands, over 17 FSG calls were being processed. A dedicated officer was provided with a CU for this specific purpose. It might be prudent to mention the allocation of appropriate resources to allow the dedicated officer to carry out this function. Now, leave aside the draft of the policy for the moment. We'll come back to that later in due course. But just on what is said in the bubble there, do you disagree with what the commenter there has said about the number of FSG calls being processed at that fire?
I do, yes.
Why do you disagree?
Because I was in the control room at the time and attended or would have been involved. I think I must have talked to the officer in charge of control at the time, Keith Diamond, and discussed that. I didn't have any reports of 17 fire survival guidance calls coming into control. I didn't witness 17 fire survival guidance calls. I don't believe there is a record of 17 fire survival guidance calls.
How many do you think there were?
From a vague recollection, potentially 4, not concurrent. I think 2 of them were concurrent and lasted maybe 45 minutes and 1 an hour. However, that whole time they weren't providing FSG advice. They provided FSG advice in the initial phases, but then I believe stayed on the phone to just offer reassurance to the caller, and that took up a great deal of the conversation.
Can I ask you please to be shown Peter Cowup's evidence at day 195? And I'd like you please to be shown page 101 in that. It's the transcript for his evidence to the inquiry. And he says at line 13, it's page 195, line 13, so the incident I attended was in Poplar, and we had 36 calls, and that was prior to the policy being in place, and he's talking about 790. And then it goes on. Are you able to help with the number 36 there?
No.
You don't know, you don't recall 36 being the number of calls, either FSG or otherwise?
No, I don't recall that. And I would say, just in terms of our experience of the control room, it was a hotel fire. It was lower down in a kitchen. I would be surprised that we received 36 calls to that incident.
Can we then look at LFB 00110785? This is an email on the 12th of November 2010. If you look at the foot of page 2, I think you'll need to scroll to that. Page 2, please. Foot of page 2 and over to the top of page 3. 12th of November 2010. From Andy Hickmott to Scott Hayward, Dave Brown, and copy to Peter Cowart, Rita Dexter, and Ron Dobson. Scott, Dave, it says. And then over the page on page 3, he says, with regards to last night's 10PF, as I'm sure you've been made aware, this was a particularly challenging incident for control, given the number and nature of fire survival calls they handled, some of which went on for over an hour. Despite the pressures, the way the information was passed to the fireground, enabling searching, and in some cases rescues to be undertaken, seemed excellent. I visited control after I left the incident about 3 a.m. and thanked Keith Diamond and his staff for all their efforts. It seems some of them really earned their money last night, and you may wish to look into whether it deserves formal recognition. Thanks. Andy Hickmott, Assistant Commissioner. Can you explain why it was a particularly challenging incident for control, given the number and nature of fire survival calls, as Andy Hickmott has recorded there?
I can't know. I was in the control room when it was occurring, and I believe I was in the control room when Andy Hickmott came to visit as well.
So,
in terms of capacity, we had sufficient capacity in the control room for that night. In fact, as I said, the 2 calls that went on for a duration of approximately an hour were because we had such capacity, and they could afford to stay on the phone, providing reassurance to some callers. So I would imagine the initial volume of calls and dealing with an incident that was a 10-pump fire, so all the subsequent actions and make-ups that control would have had to have done might have made it challenging. I'm not sure what other incidents were going on in London at that time as well. I can't recall from that incident, but that may have added to that as well.
So do you disagree with Andy Hickmott's statement that this was a particularly challenging incident for control, given the number and nature of fire survival calls they handled?
I think it was a challenge for them in terms of ensuring that they were gathering the right information and providing the right advice to callers, and then relaying all that information to the incident ground.
And was that incident, to put it colloquially, all in a night's work?
I would have thought some operators and control staff would have thought that was all in a night's work, yes.
Can you explain why it was, given that Andy Hickmott thought that you ought to have some kind of formal recognition?
I think it reads there that actually the information that we passed to the fireground appeared to be excellent from his point of view. So that would have ensured that we had provided the right advice and guidance, that we had collated all the information and passed it down to the incident commander, enabling them to do their role.
Getting it right, all in a night's work, isn't normally something that deserves formal recognition, formal praise, is it?
No, and as I said, I would have thought some control officers would have thought that that was all in a night's work and part of the role, and maybe others wouldn't. Maybe Keith Diamond would have thought it was particularly challenging at points and deserved some recognition. I don't know. I can't recall. There was nothing that Andy expressed to me on the night, but did say, well done.
Can we look at another email about this incident at LFB 3033213? This is an email from you on the 30th of November 2010 about that incident. And you say, "Hi Scott, I've asked Red Watch to carry out a debrief of this incident in anticipation of a PRC where we can either attend or feed back information relating to the communications. I imagine the outcomes from the PRC then being looked at in line with FSG work and any recommendations being taken to the board for approval. As I was in attendance on the night, and I have already taken some relevant issues and discussed them with Pat at last week's meeting, it really is the information flow that Pat and I are working on." So it looks as if you did attend the debrief with Red Watch, is that right?
Yes.
And did you feed back information in relation to communications?
Yes, it reads like I did, yes.
Do you remember what you fed back?
No, but I think just from reading the two emails that the communications from control to the incident ground were suitable and sufficient and was received positively. My reference to the information flow that Pat and I are working on probably meant that that was successful, and maybe we talked about maybe during that incident was information received back from the CU to control as well on progress of the incident and what was happening. I can't recall.
Do you remember whether you fed anything back in particular about the number of FSG calls?
I would think just on that initially people had raised the issue that there were 17 FSG calls, and then after the PRC had been held and that actually there wasn't any further work on dealing with a large number of FSG calls like that we may have clarified the number of FSG calls we received.
Was there a performance review of command?
Potentially, but I'm not sure. Control were at that point invited regularly to PRCs. I could be wrong.
Right. Now let's look at NFB 000-33654. This is a spreadsheet from the Incident Monitoring Database. If we can have that in native form, please. LFB 000-33654. And if we scroll down to line 34, the date of the incident, 11th of November 2010, we can see the incident number at 1915799101. You look and see that on the screen. That's the Marriott Hotel 10-pump fire. If you look across to column V, you can see some comments. And it says, bottom right-hand corner of your screen, identified need to systematically manage fire survival calls, appointed dedicated SM to deal and provided command support and resources in the form of an additional CEU and appliance crews. Were you aware of that identified need to, quote, systematically manage fire survival calls? Close quotes.
No, I don't think, from my personal experience, I didn't have access or receive comments from the IMP database until my return from CFAR in 2015.
Right. I mean, this is almost 2 years before you left for CFOA.
Yes.
Did anybody feed back to you on, as a result of this incident in November 2010, the need to systematically manage fire survival calls?
No, like I say, I don't think Control ever saw or were asked to comment on IMP entries.
Right.
Before 2015, maybe 2014 when I was away, that happened. But certainly the result of that, so an SM and an additional CU and appliance crew, we were notified of because we obviously had to then adjust our mobilising system
I follow.
to take account of that.
I follow. So nobody identified. Well, let me ask it this way: if the need to systematically manage fire survival calls was a need identified arising out of some kind of defect or deficiency in the control room and the handling of the calls in the control room, would you have expected that to have been fed back to you?
Yes, but in honesty, I wouldn't have expected an operational performance of command to raise any actions that happened in the control room, and that I am taking as an operational action, which is why they've suggested a command support vehicle and staff
Right,
be added in addition.
Although this is not your document and you didn't see it at the time, in your experience, given that you were in the control room at the time, is the fair way of reading that is a criticism of the handling of fire survival calls on the incident ground?
Yes, management of the information that we were passing to them.
There's another event I want to ask you about, which is in the February 2011. Can I ask you, please, to be shown LFB 3090336? This is an email chain entitled FW4 recent high-rise incident 050220011 from John Simpson to Peter Cowup. You were not copied in on it, and I'm assuming you wouldn't have seen it at the time. But he says this: at the incident on Friday, when I responded to paging control, told me that there were 5 fire survival calls in progress. So on arrival, I detailed an SM to gather information from control and others about number, location and circumstances in order that I could accurately direct firefighting crews to their location to assist those in need. Now, do you remember that incident?
No, I don't.
I think you were on duty during that 24-hour period, and we can see that from the documents below that. Let me just make that good for you. If you go down to page 3, we can see the daily bulletin for Saturday, the 5th of February 2011. At the bottom of the page, over to page 4, at the top it says duty officers for the 24 hours. And I think I'm right in saying that's up to that point, isn't it?
No, sorry. Could you go back? The daily bulletin you've shown was
yes,
for the...
go back to the bottom of page 3.
The 5th.
RMC information bulletin as at 800 hours, Saturday, 5th of February 2011.
Yes.
And then over the top, onto page 4, it says duty officers for 24 hours.
Yes.
Do I take it that it's the 24 hours up to that time?
So from the 5th to 0800 the next morning.
Oh, I see.
On the 6th.
I see. So this is actually the duty officers coming on as on the Saturday morning of the Saturday, the 5th of February, not going off after 24 hours.
No.
I follow. Nonetheless, are you able to recall details of that incident where there are 5 survival calls in progress?
No, and like I say, I appreciate I might have been on duty for the 5th and 6th, but I don't recall.
You don't recall this incident?
No.
You don't recall any learning or feedback or anything of the kind? Nonetheless.
No, and as my role, I probably would have, if we'd had that and I'd experienced that, I would have spoken to the control commander and we would have had a debrief. So I'm not convinced. The fire was on the 5th, was it?
Well, the incident was on, I think, the 4th, the Friday the 4th. Because I'm going off the email I showed you.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know the answer to your question. But if it is correct, taking the email on page 1 that I read to you, that there were 5 survival calls in progress, is that not something that you would have expected to have found out when you did come back onto duty, whenever that was, after that date?
I'm sure it would have been discussed, but if I wasn't on duty, then the duty brigade control manager would have dealt with that and raised any issues. That's how we worked. Anyone that picked up an incident who was the duty and that would have attended or been notified by control would have dealt then with the immediate issues.
Can we then look at LFB 00111471? This is a draft of Fire Survival Guidance Calls Policy 790, which at that time had been accorded the new policy number Draft 155, and this is the version current as at the 10th of February 2011, still in draft form, and you made comments on this document. If we go down to page 5 and look at paragraph 7.10, we can see what that draft paragraph says. 7.10 says, the IC should consider the early ordering of additional CU to assist in managing the FSG calls, especially if control is dealing with multiple FSG calls. Other personnel may be required to manage information if a large number of FSG calls have been received. Control has experience of handling multiple FSG calls relating to a single incident. And then you can see a deletion on the right-hand side next to that, where the words up to 5 have been deleted. You see that?
Yes, I can.
And if you go to page 14, you can see that on the 1st of June 2011, as the third entry down, Stibbard J inserted multiple and deleted up to 5. You see?
Yes.
That was you doing that, was it?
I would imagine so. It shows my name.
Why did you delete up to 5 and insert instead multiple?
I don't know.
What was wrong with up to 5?
Reading about it now, nothing. I'm not sure if previously, when we'd been changing documents, we'd been asked to put multiple and not put a figure on it. So I don't know.
At the time, you were assisting with the drafting of PN 790,
yes.
It's draft 155. Did you have any discussions at that time, this would be now June 2011, with anybody about what was meant by the term multiple FSG?
I think we had frequent discussions, myself and Pat and others, throughout the Lacanau investigation, and whilst we were looking at policy 790 as well.
Was there a consensus between you and those with whom you were discussing the potential numbers of FSG calls about what multiple meant?
No, I don't believe so. And I think that actually we have a procedure in London Control where we send additional attendants to multiple calls. And at that point, that was 3. So we were familiar with a term of multiple, meaning more than 3. So perhaps that's when it came in, we used the same definition.
Why did you think it meant 2 or 3 when, as we've seen, there were incidents in the previous year and at the time, the Haygate Challenge, which contemplated more than 3. So we've seen the 4 at Haygate Challenge, which happened the same month, June 2011. We'd seen 5, perhaps at one incident, which you can't recall, in the February of that year, and we'd seen 4, I think, as you told us, at the Marriott fire, even if not 17. Why were you sticking to 2 or 3 for your multiple?
I don't think I personally was sticking to anything multiple. As I said, a concept in LFB control is that we mobilise additional attendance on what was then 3 calls to an incident. So perhaps, and that was known as multiple calls and a multiple call attendance. So perhaps that's where conceptually LFB just used that as a term. But in my opinion, multiple, not being specific and just putting multiple, would acknowledge that we could receive up to 5.
Now, taking a slightly sideways step, do you remember that the revised version of GRA 3.2 was published by the DCLG in February 2014?
No, I don't.
You don't? Do I take it from that you were not aware of it when it came out?
No, I wasn't aware of it when it came out, and when I returned from LFB, wasn't aware of its existence. And during the seminars we'd run with national control room managers, it hadn't been mentioned in any of those either when we were talking about national guidance for control.
Do I take it that at no stage, is this right, at no stage before the Grenfell Tower fire, did you ever have any discussion within the LFB or outside the LFB about that part of GRA 3.2 which covered fire survival guidance calls?
No.
Do you know whether anybody else, to your knowledge, within the LFB was involved in any such discussions?
I don't know.
Can I then turn to the Adair Tower fire on the 31st of October 2015, which you mentioned as one of those fires where there had been fire survival guidance calls. First, were you involved in that incident?
No, I wasn't. I wasn't the duty manager.
Were you involved in any debrief after the incident?
Not that I recall in terms of debrief or PRC. By that time, we were being invited to PRC, so I don't believe I was involved in that either.
We were involved in any kind of review of the actions of Brigade Control as a result of that incident?
There might have been some discussion with either the senior operation manager that took that or the principal operations manager. I'm not sure who was on duty. We may have discussed it as a group, and we may have discussed it at Brigade Control management meeting as well with the operations managers.
Are you aware of how many FSG calls were handled at that incident?
Yes, I am.
How many was that?
I believe there were 6.
You believe there were 6?
Yes.
Now let's just look at the debrief pro forma for the incident at LFB 30's 35092. Here it is. And if you go to page 2, you can see what incident this was. It's Adair Tower identified. The date of the debrief is 31st of October 2015, the same date as the incident. Have you seen this document before?
Not that I can recall, no.
If we go to page 2, we're on page 2, you can see number of calls, 24. Do you see that? And then on page 5, in the left-hand column, it says, between 0854 and 908, 9 FSG calls dealt with, along with 15 other calls to premises. You see that?
I do, yes.
Have you any reason to doubt the accuracy of those figures?
Yes, I have, because I recently listened to the calls from that incident.
And what is it about listening to those calls that gave you to doubt the accuracy of those figures?
Because I could listen to the exchange of information between the operator and the control and the caller, know when they were giving fire survival guidance. And a number of those calls where that was occurring, control officers were providing reassurance and not fire survival guidance. And I think that's probably, that's not a purposeful error, but I would imagine if this was completed on the day as well, that actually supervisors may not have had time to listen to and record all of them. I think Scott Hayward said in his evidence that sometimes, whilst they were categorised as an FSG call, because the supervisor would record that as that, sometimes they weren't giving FSG advice and guidance, but there was a period of reassurance going on and just information gathering from the caller.
Right. That answer tends to suggest another question, which is it right that whether or not a call is an FSG call depends on interpretation? It depends on the exercise of judgment about the content of the call?
No, I would say that it very much depends on what the caller is telling the control officer.
And you listened to those calls and decided, did you, that based on what the caller was telling the control officer, they didn't count, or some of them, 3 of them, didn't count as FSG calls properly so called?
Based on what the caller was telling the control officer and what the control officer and how the control officer was speaking to the caller. So
somebody made an error in identifying 9 when they should have said 6?
Yes. And as I try to say, if this was completed on the actual day of their duty, maybe they hadn't got round to listening to all those calls in detail.
That would suggest that the identification of a call as an FSG call wasn't fully embedded in the brigade at this time, by which I mean that the identification of a call as an FSG call was something that not everybody could do accurately.
I think that during the incident, and that was a large incident, and there would have been, I think there's a number of calls received as well, is there? Other 15 calls to a premises. It would have been very hard for a supervisor to determine that. They would have relied on the control officer, as we usually do, to make them aware of it, so they could provide support and gather some further information. So by the time a supervisor or an operations manager the incident was finished and would actually get down to listening to the calls in full, then that might have been amended.
In fact, I think AOM Norman was at the debrief. And indeed, as you could see from the page, had entered control and assisted the supervisory team. She is a pretty experienced AOM, wasn't she?
She is, yes.
She even then was, in 2015, yes?
Yes.
Yes, so she would know the difference between an ordinary call and an FSG call, no?
Yes.
Yes. If we look at the bottom, well, we don't need to. I think you would agree that even at 6, that was a multiple FSG situation, yes?
Yes, I would have agreed that at 3 calls, yes.
Yes. Now, looking at the incident debrief form, and I know you haven't seen it all, but one gets no sense from it that 9 FSGs or even 6 FSGs was out of the ordinary, nor the fact that for many CROs this was their first FSG call. One gets no sense that this presented any particular practical problem. I mean, take it from me that there's nothing in there that does that. This isn't a completely out of the blue unusual event.
Well, I would just like to say on that, through phase 1 and this evidence, specifically some control officers have mentioned Adair Tower, and that would imply to me that actually this was a significant incident that was out of the ordinary and didn't take place on a regular basis.
It wouldn't have taken place on a regular basis, but would it be right at least that as at the 31st of October 2015, when this incident took place, control would not only have regarded 9 or 6, it doesn't matter, FSG calls as unthinkably unrealistic, but actually considered such a possibility well catered for?
Looking at the time that occurred between 8:50 for a 906, we would have had 15 staff on duty. We might have had, and also some of the training or OST to support us. So I would get the impression from just reading this little bit that it was manageable. But like I say, I wasn't the on-call duty brigade control manager. They would be able to provide you with a bit more detail.
Can we look at LFB 000-35109? This is an email from Keith Diamond to Liz Hims on the 2nd of November 2015, a few days after the Adair Tower incident. And we can see a brief summary of the incident in the text. And 4 lines down, it says, Tony Biles, who's the person who's speaking, states the incident was very dynamic in the early stages, and without the work undertaken by the control officers, it may well have resulted in a number of fatalities. As it was, 50 persons were rescued, 24 through FSG by control, and 26 through on-scene advice and rescue by operational crews. Remarkably, injuries were kept to a minimum and of a more minor nature. Now, even though the figure there appears to have been more like 9 FSGs, or 6, as you say, through having listened to the calls, instead of the 24 here, would you agree nonetheless that by this stage, late October, early November 2015, you and the LFB Brigade Control were well aware that an incident could certainly result in well more than 2 or 3 FSG calls?
Yes, the 24 might be referring to 24 individuals, though. So even though we took 6 FSG calls, there may have been more than one occupier in that flat. Therefore, that's where the 24 would have come from.
Right. Well, we've got a range of numbers, I think, between your 6 and the 24 in this email and the 9 in the debrief document we've seen, even allowing for differences in how one arrives at those numbers. Nonetheless, did the Adair Tower fire prompt you to review any of Control's FSG call management systems?
No, not at all. So I think that that email from Keith is a positive outcome, as were the assistants in the debrief, and I didn't see all the comments that staff had made in the debrief, but I get the impression from this that whilst it was challenging, it was manageable. There's no suggestion that Control reached capacity and calls weren't being able to be received, or we couldn't deal with anything that the incident had required and had asked us for, and that information about those callers were passed to the incident ground successfully.
In a nutshell, does that tell us that the successful outcome of this incident meant that there were no lessons to be learnt from it for the future?
No, I'd have to look at the debrief, and maybe a conversation after we'd attended the PRC might have raised some additional learning points as well.
At any rate, no learning points that prompted you to review Control's FSG call management systems or training for control room officers or supervisors?
No, not personally. Again, I didn't attend the debrief, so I would have expected to be informed had there been anything.
Yes. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, I think it is. Thank you very much. Well, it's time we stop for the day, Ms. Smith. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to come back again on Monday of next week to continue your evidence, but I think you were probably expecting to do that.
I was, thank you.
And we'll resume therefore at 10 o'clock on Monday, please. And over the weekend, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it.
No.
All right?
Thank
you very much. Would you like to go to the usher then, please? Thank you very much. 10 o'clock on Monday then, please.